For this week's amp video, I have a Marshall JCM2000 100-watt dual super lead on the Workbench. JCM2000s have a poor reputation, not for their sound but for their reliability. These amps suffer from a bad tube printed circuit board. The tube sockets are mounted directly to the printed circuit board. The pins on the tube sockets transfer heat from the tubes directly to the circuit board itself. This is not usually a problem if it's properly manufactured. Unfortunately, Marshall never got the circuit boards completely right. Nearly all these amps will suffer from heat-related failure of the tube printed circuit board. The very early ones suffer from it most as they were made incorrectly by the source manufacturer. This amp is one of those early ones. The PC board, when it fails, becomes conductive. This amp runs at very high voltages. As the board becomes conductive, that high voltage starts to leak to the rest of the amp circuit. That causes all kinds of problems. These problems started on this particular amp over a decade ago. I have done what I could to get this amp to sound as good and last without fixing the root cause, a bad circuit board. One thing I did was make the back panel with built-in fans to get the heat away from the board and out of the amp. I did this early on, years ago, and it did extend the service life of this amp. It was always a kludge. It was never going to fix the root issue. It was only going to delay the ultimate fix, a new and very expensive replacement tube board. For a while, Marshall made replacement boards. They were quite expensive. They cost enough that it was hard to justify putting a $250 replacement part into an amp that was worth $600. Nobody wanted these amps a decade ago. The board is expensive because it is basically the entire amp. Yes, there are some other boards too, but they are things like the power supply, tone controls, switching and I/O circuitry. This new board is basically a new amp. Marshall realized this too and stopped making the replacement boards. For a while, there was no longer a fix available. Once the board went bad, you either lived with it or bought a new amp. There was some very intrusive fixes that involved removing some circuit board material, but that was not effective and the board would keep getting worse until it had to be replaced. Finally, late last year, a third party made a replacement board for these amps. The owner of this amp decided it was worth fixing and bought one. The board is made by Valve Tube guitar amps. It can be purchased in England for about £250 plus shipping. The cost is already about $300 to $350 once everything is taken into account. That is a lot of money to put into an amp that's only worth $700 to $800. If you love an amp, it's probably not something you can justify unless you can do the work yourself or you know a guy who will do it for you. This third-party board looks like it uses better caps. It also has better diodes that make the DC heater voltage for the preamp. The bridge rectifier that Marshall used fails quite often. It's a replacement on this amp that was done by myself a few years ago when it failed. I think this new board is a step up. We'll see how it sounds. Next time I'll show you what it takes to replace the board and fix this amp. It is not hard, but it does require that you know how to do it and how to bias an amp when the board is replaced. Until the next one.